Today I'd like to look into the argument as to why regulation isn't a good word to use in connection with mental health. As soon as we look into the word regulation, this does become apparent. Regulation means that we control something, we control whatever's going on to approximate an abstract value or to bring it in line with some kind of defined value. That's a very straightforward thing. It's a cybernetic notion, it's a mechanical notion. We start off with a value that we have said to be ideal, and whenever the system departs from this value, we bring it back again. That's regulation. So what we're really doing is making everything obey the rule. It's kind of as simple as that, really. And I guess that the origin of the word regulation kind of gives this impression as well. I imagine it has something to do with the Latin for king, rex. The rule is the king. And we all know what it means. When you're dealing with a king, you have to bow down to the king. You have to be very deferential to the king. You have to obey the king, basically. And if you don't, it's your own fault. You should have known better. We don't usually look into this what I would call the sinister side of the word regulation, or regulate. And the reason we don't is because whatever value we've hit upon, we automatically take it for granted that this is the right and proper value, and it's the value that nature herself has given us to adhere to. It's the right thing, which is a fundamental kind of concept in our thinking. The right thing. It's right. This is absolutist thinking, because it's absolutely right, and there can be no ambiguity when it comes to right. It's like, well, it could be right. You know, it might be right, or it's right if you want it to be right, or it's right for some people. It's not right for other people. There's none of that. There's this very great clarity that it just is right. End of story. It's like someone kicking you in the head with a big boot. That's what right is like. There's no argument. But this notion that there is a value that is just unquestionably right, and all we have to worry about is making sure that we obey the rule, it's clearly nonsensical. Obviously it's nonsensical. Right is a construct. It's an idea of ours. We say it is, and then once we've said it is, we forget that we ourselves said it was, and we act as if God himself has written it on a stone tablet. And that never happens. There is no such thing as any kind of definite value that has been written on a stone tablet with regard to mental health. With regard to the boiling point of water, you could say, okay, at normal atmospheric pressure, it's 100 degrees centigrade, and you could say, also we have all these standards and all these constants in the physical world. So to a certain extent, we can say that they're given. They're not really, because they are, even the physical constants are the result of a cosmic dice being shook. And if we went back to the drawing board and shook the dice again, we might get different constants. And there isn't any physicist that's going to argue with that. There might be one or two, I suppose. But the idea is that chance is what gives rise to whatever constants or definite statements about the world we might do. So if that's the case, if all of the constants come out of the shaking of a cosmic dice, then that means they're not really absolute at all. They're relative. They're relative to the dice. But you won't spend too much time talking about physical constants because probably people aren't going to be that interested unless they happen to be of that particular bent. But in the world of mental health, how can, even if the hardest science known, physics, won't swear by the absolute existence of any defined values, how can we in mental health be so damn cocky about it and assume that our values for whatever constitutes the right way or the wrong way have any bearing at all? And the bearing that they do have is that everything we think about mental health or how we should be or what life is about or how human beings should be, anything like that, that's all cultural stuff. Depends on our culture. That's what culture does. It presents a certain way of looking at the world. Culture's fine as long as we remember it as culture. So when we go on and about mental health, we should prefix it according to our culture. And our culture could be anything. Culture is a dice. Could go one way, could go another way. It's this way here, and it's that way over there. And then in an alternative universe, our culture might well be totally different. So what we're talking about is pure relativity. That's what we need to see, really. Forget all this belief in absolutes, because there are no absolutes. That's just it's kind of like a toddler who wants to suck on a dummy, or maybe they don't want to suck on it, but they've been trained to suck on it by their parents. Absolutes are a dummy. We like to suck on it at a certain stage, but we are going to have to give up the dummy at some stage, because there are no absolutes, no matter what naive comfort we might get out of the idea. So if there are no absolutes, what price? Regulation. We can't regulate because we don't know how things should be. Now, in the human body, we have a certain there's a certain degree of validity in saying we know how things should be. We know that the head should be on top of the neck. We know that the knees should have a certain degree of flexion. We know that the core body temperature should be that. We know all that, and that's fine, but there exists nothing at all in mental health to parallel this, because mental health is culture, what it means to be a human being. How am I supposed to be a human being, present myself as a human being, go around doing human being type things? That's all culture. It's not written down anywhere. Okay, so straight away we're going to run foul of all the organized religions, because they all have tablets or pieces of paper telling us exactly how it should be, exactly what a human being should do. Ask the Mormons, ask the Jehovah's Witnesses, ask anyone, ask any of those crowd. They'll tell you. They've got the absolutes. It's written down. God says it. But God never said that. People say God said it, which is very presumptuous of us. God doesn't go around making absolute statements. Humans do that because humans, we're kind of in that infantile stage where we want to have absolutes. So we make out that God has provided us with absolutes and has told us how. But he hasn't, or she hasn't. God hasn't. Reality hasn't. The Tao hasn't provided us with absolutes, if we want to talk about it that way. The Tao that can be described is not the Tao. So we could translate Tao very roughly by just saying the way things are, or the way of things. And the way of things that can be described is not the way of things. That comes from up here. It's our thoughts. So what we're actually doing when we get into regulation and management and control in the mental health field is that we are taking our thoughts to be the number one important thing, the basis that everything else must agree with. Everything else has to line up with my thoughts, agree with my thoughts. My thoughts are there about the world. I have to make things agree with my thoughts. That's regulation. My thoughts are king. This is a cultural thing. It's a very particular cultural thing that we can associate with the Western rational tradition. That's our culture. We worship thought. We worship rationality. Everything else comes second fiddle. So it seems perfectly natural to us to regulate things because we never question that our thoughts about things should come first. But then it's possible to question this and question it very radically. And we can say, well, mental health isn't really putting thoughts first and making everything else line up with those thoughts. That's actually the antithesis of mental health. That's the state of slavery to our thoughts. That is a state of bondage, a state of attachment. That is not mental health. It's not mental health because it makes us miserable, wretched, and limited, and it causes us to be a wretched shadow of what we could be if we weren't enthralled to our thoughts, which are extraordinarily limited. Limited is the wrong word. They're arbitrary. Could be this, could be that. But whatever they are, they're an impoverished way of talking about the world or describing the world. There is no way to describe the world. So once we do start describing it, we've automatically impoverished ourselves. We don't mind that because we'll pay the price of living an impoverished existence because we have ontological security. And that's so very important to us. We'll take any crappy version of life just as long as there's ontological security in it. Now, it so happens that because this thing called ontological security doesn't exist, the fact that it doesn't exist will mean that things are going to get shaky from time to time because we'll start to be aware that it doesn't exist and we'll start to freak out. So then we start regulating. We start to get ourselves back on track because we don't want to drift off into that space where there are no absolutes, where there are no descriptions. So what we've done here is twisted everything around so that when reality comes into play, reality being the absence of any handy framework that we can orientate ourselves to, we see that as being mentally unwell, and so we try and re-establish that framework, whilst actually having that framework there is, as I've said, the antithesis of mental health, being a state of slavery. Slavery can't really be seen as mental health. We could say, what is mental health? Freedom not to be stuck to any artificial, arbitrary views of the world or descriptions of the world. That's freedom. We're not all seeing things in the one generic way. We could say, well, reality is generous. It's not mean-spirited. It's not a jealous God like Jehovah that says you worship me or it's not going to be so good for you. It's like mafia boss. God is a mafia boss. Reality is generous. It doesn't hold us to any one particular way of talking about it, existing within it. It's all true. It's all good, whatever. It's all life. It's all reality. There's no need for rules. There's no need for stipulations and regulations and all that. We produce the regulations because we're afraid of freedom, because we're afraid of reality, so we make prisons for ourselves. This is so obvious. It's been said so many times. So really in the field of mental health, it would help us to have kind of become a little bit more broad-minded and understand what other disciplines have been saying philosophy and existential psychotherapy. It's not a narrow, rational little domain like accounting might be. And I'm not slagging off accounting because accounting's supposed to be narrow and rational. Accounting wouldn't work otherwise. If everything was right in accounting, then there would be no right, and the accounts would never come out. So it has to be just one right answer. In reality itself, there is no one right answer. There is no anything like that. Now, that hurts us because, no, I just want to know what the right way is so I can do it. Because that's where we're at. But no, reality is infinitely generous. There's no arrows pointing us in the right direction. We don't get to be in a prison. If we want a prison, we make it for ourselves because reality ain't going to put us in prison. That's up to us, and so that's what we do. Our thoughts can never be the template for everything. So if we see that the state of bondage or attachment to our thoughts, or just blind belief in whatever our stupid thoughts say, is the antithesis of mental health, we can see that mental health must be the degree to which we can separate ourselves from our thinking. So what our thinking says is not what we believe. In fact, we don't believe anything because belief always comes from thoughts. Belief is another word for thought. We go around believing all these things every day, and that's just because our thought tells us that they are true and we are slaves and we believe our thoughts. So if we want to have mental health, we have to separate ourselves from thoughts. That doesn't mean getting rid of thoughts, annihilating them, crushing them, kicking them up the arse, rolling over them with a steamroller. There's no violence to thought. There's no need to do violence to thoughts. They're no threat to us. Just as long as we don't automatically believe them, no matter how stupid they are. A thought is a thought. If my way of seeing the world is different from the thought's assumed viewpoint on things, then that's put the thought in its right place. The thought is only a thought, it's only a belief, it's only a viewpoint. I don't have to fight against it, because if I fought against it, that would mean that I actually believe it to be true and worth fighting against. There's absolutely no need to fight against thoughts or in any way try to control them or regulate them in accordance with some other thought, because of course if I'm regulating my thought, that must mean I'm regulating it in relation to yet another thought, which is pure stupid. How can I regulate my thought without using some other different type of thought, which gives me the right idea about what regulation, what the defined value should be to regulate the other? The whole thing is so stupid. It's amazing that we can't see it. Regulation only takes place in the world of absolutes, in a world where there is an assumed framework that we never question. And we're free to do that if we want to. We're free to make up a framework. We're free to say that we're living in a world of absolutes. But then all of that just becomes it just becomes different ways in which we delude ourselves and trick ourselves and deceive ourselves. So we can't really dignify all of that business with the word mental health. And we can't even say that. We can't say that we're trying to help people when we try and urge them or coax them to regulate themselves. If there's no guideposts, there's no regulation, and there are no guideposts. Show me the guideposts. Where are they? You can scurry off into the field and hammer a kind of signpost in there, but you did it. It wasn't there before you did it. So what this does, it makes life a lot more challenging. It's challenging right from the very beginning, because of the whole question of separating ourselves from our thoughts, from the thinking mind. So we'd say then, okay, that sounds good. Actually, it does sound good. So how do I do it? So straight away, I'm looking for guidance. I'm looking for signposts. I'm looking for a way for me to regulate the process by which I detach from thought and cultivate a bit of space between me and my thoughts, or which isn't a good way of putting it actually, because me is a thought, but we want to have a way of regulating this process by which our consciousness becomes freed from thought is a better way. But that just entangles us in thought even more. So in other words, there is no way to facilitate this process by which consciousness becomes independent of thought. There's absolutely no way to do it. There's absolutely no method. There's absolutely nothing you can do, no matter how you strain. Not necessarily physically, like a weightlifter, but maybe like the intellectual equivalent of a weightlifter, straining. How do I separate myself? That's an intellectual exercise. There is no straining. But it doesn't mean it's not possible. It's actually, not only is it possible, it happens all the time, because that's exactly what life does. That's what reality does. It is a continuous process of moving away from equilibrium values. No matter what we do, no matter what fixes we get ourselves into, no matter how deep a hole we dig for ourselves, there's always going to be reality there, and reality is always, always, always going to be moving us away from our fixed ideas, or all ideas are fixed, from our ideas of reality. So all we have to do is let reality do what it does, and what it always does, and what it always will do. But of course that isn't quite as easy as it might sound.